Welcome to Trust the Badge. In this episode, I interviewed Dr. Daniel Reinhardt, who is a former police officer and the author of the novel Rethinking the Police. Dr. Reinhardt emphasizes that this novel is not anti-police, but rather creative in its efforts of ideas to reform police culture. The link to the book is in the description of this episode. We'll begin with an introduction of Dr. Reinhardt.
I'm Dan Reinhardt. I was a police officer for 24 years in an urban community, and I'm the author of Rethinking the Police. I have a PhD from Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in leadership.
Thank you so much, Dr. Reinhardt, for being here. Let's just start off with the basics. What encouraged you to become a police officer?
For me, I didn't necessarily have a dream, like a lifelong dream to be a police officer. I got out of the military and I had a family, and I started taking civil service tests. And one of them I took was for police officer. I was interested in doing it, and I scored high enough on the list to get hired. So not
That
too
sounds
exciting
great.
of a story, but that's how it happens.
Perfect. No problem at all. And you're here to talk mainly about your book, and I was really glad to read it beforehand. I thought it was very insightful. Before we jump into that, can you share a bit about your personal journey as a police officer?
My journey as it relates to the book, or my journey just in general as what I did while I was a police officer?
As a police officer.
Yeah. So I got hired in the mid to late 90s, and I started in the jail as a correction officer, spent a year doing that, then went to the road as a police officer, worked mostly night shift, some afternoon shifts. After about 3 years, I was a community police officer in a large housing project. There were just three of us. It was at one time probably the most violent area of the city. And me and the other two officers were just responsible for that area. That was the only place we worked as community police officers. I went back to the road after I did that for about 3 years, worked nights and afternoon shift. And then I went into the schools as a school resource officer, was there for 3 years, got promoted to sergeant, then the lieutenant, and did various things as a lieutenant, anywhere from internal affairs to shift commander to running the radio room in the jail.
That sounds like quite the resume. Thank you for sharing that. What encouraged you or led you to write Rethinking the Police as a police officer?
Well, as a police officer, I was working on my PhD at Southern in leadership, and I wanted to write about police leadership. And so it just kind of evolved from there. And one of the focuses of the program was to focus on solving a specific problem. So I wanted to just examine how we could deal with the violent incidents that were happening at the hands of police officers. So that's how it evolved into that. The book came from my dissertation.
Are there any, just by chance, it's okay if you don't, but are there any sort of stories is there any experience that you had while being a police officer that really made you think that this is what you had to write about?
Oh, well, I mean, and the book covers a lot of it. I started to realize just how the police culture was affecting me, my thinking, and the way I saw the world, even a few years into the job. It didn't take long for me to realize that the leadership in the police department, that this probably wasn't the way things should be done. And it was just, and as you encountered officers in other police departments, it was really the same there too. So I had an idea that there was toxic leadership in policing. I knew the culture was a problem. And so many experiences just from being out there dealing with the police leadership kind of set the stage when I started to do my research for my dissertation.
Okay. And in your book, you mentioned that you were long unaware of the ways the police department's culture was shaping you. So, what were some key moments or realizations that really opened your eyes to the issues within the system?
Yeah, I began to realize I was probably, I don't think I even covered this in the book, but I was on vacation after like 2 years of working nights and afternoons and getting away. And I just realized how negative my attitude had been and how I saw people, some of my family members too, like my mom could see it happening, just the negativity and the oppositional view I had with people. So in the scholars and researchers would call it the us them worldview in policing. I wouldn't have been able to articulate it that way at the time, but that's exactly what I was going through. You start to just silo yourself and have a very adversarial view towards the public and people who are police officers.
Okay. And I know you can't talk too much about your book, but for what you can talk about, your book does propose a new model of policing based on servant leadership. Could you just elaborate on what this model entails and how it differs from today's approach?
Yeah. So the model is real specific in the book, but the idea is it's really a synthesis of pastoral leadership and servant leadership for a secular police department, but it targets the problematic aspects in police culture that I argue in the book support an ethic that can lead to police violence and support specific strategies that are common in policing that can lead to biased enforcement and contentious encounters that can evolve into police brutality. So this leadership model is tailor-made for police agencies in a way that would train officers and shape the culture in a different way. And it's sort of transformation from the inside out so that as the leadership changes, the culture changes, and then the strategies for engaging crime and disorder would be different. And what I argue is that once you change the leadership and the culture, you can implement procedural justice and community policing authentically. And my argument is that it doesn't really take place today, even if it's purported to take place in name.
Okay. And for the audience, could you just define pastoral and servant leadership?
Well, servant leadership is basically the idea that leaders are called to serve. That's the basic principle. And then pastoral leadership, I draw from a specific source called Christ-centered followership. And in that pastoral leadership, it's that you follow first. As pastors, they follow Christ first, and then they become shepherds of the people. So applied to policing, it's that the police officer doesn't, or the police leader doesn't have autonomous intrinsic power, but follows the public first who he's called to serve and uses power judiciously. And it's the idea of this servant shepherd leader. And it's a very detailed model, but that's the basic idea of it. The servant and shepherd, the police leader who serves and also shepherds, protects, and governs his people.
Okay. Why is it that these models are the appropriate models compared to what we have today?
Are you asking why my model, I believe, is the right model compared to the models today?
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, today's model is leads towards heavy reliance on positional power and toxic leadership. And what I argue is that cultivates social distance and dehumanization between police leaders and the culture. Officers then reciprocate that against citizens, that there's a social distance and dehumanization. That combination of social distance and dehumanization is the formula for abuse. If you look historically, anytime one group has power, is socially distanced and dehumanizes another group, there's going to be violence and death. So my point is that the leadership is building this culture and that this new model pushes back against toxic leadership and addresses that very trend in police culture that is social distance dehumanization leading to abuse. So it targets the heart of the problem in police culture and leadership.
Speaking of police culture, you mentioned that a lot in your book. And just as right now, you really emphasize the point of police culture. So, what is the importance of it and how exactly does it work?
Well, police culture, like all places, have an organizational culture, but one of the things that makes culture particularly formative is that it's been shown to be more influential than the formal rules and also known to oppose the formal rules. So when police culture is promoting social distance and dehumanization, then even if formal external rules are changing and policies and procedures in place, it's going to resist it. And I give many examples in the book how they've made external changes, but that the police culture is the true driving force and shaping force of what police officers do on the job. So in the police department, then, given this reality, police culture is the most important aspect to address when it comes to shaping the behavior of officers.
That makes a lot of sense. Also, as you may agree, and as I've read in your press kit as well, and as someone who really advocates for law enforcement and the building of trust between both the community and law enforcement, I really do believe that the phrase defund the police and the entire movement is terrible. It won't help the community get anywhere, and it won't help law enforcement get anywhere. In your opinion, why do you think that defunding the police is not the answer for communities seeking reform?
Well, anytime you talk about the police, you're stepping into a political conversation. So the extreme at the right would be there's absolutely nothing wrong with the police, and any criticism of them is just completely unwarranted. The extreme at the left is to defund them, to abolish them. Neither of those solutions are helpful. The mechanisms for good policing are in place. Community policing is a good way to police communities. The procedural justice philosophy of policing that I cover in the book is a good foundational philosophy for policing. And those two things together would be a great combination to control crime, bring peace in the community. So the short of it is that the mechanisms are there and the police force are there, but it needs reform, which means changing within, not radical change where you're defunding or abolishing, because you need the police. And of course, not dismissing the problematic issues. So my solution, or what I propose, really comes down the center between the two extremes at the left and right. And it's one that I think values the police and stresses the importance of the police. The last thing we need to do is defund them. In fact, if you really want to implement long-term strategies and solutions, you're going to probably have to increase the funding.
I completely agree. As someone who doesn't believe on either extreme, first of all, nationally, our police force is not perfect, but also that does not mean that our police force nationally is terrible as well. I believe that each community has their own sort of policing systems that need reforms depending on what the community wants. But for the most part, I do believe that many police officers across the country seek to actually serve and protect their people. And what it comes down to, unfortunately, is that many communities protest. And as we've seen in 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, we've seen that many communities across the nation were advocating to defund the police.
Mm.
I personally saw that as a threat to law enforcement, which would actually only worsen community policing. And when you think about it, when you take the money away from law enforcement, all you do is you take those resources away from them. You decrease the number of law enforcement officers in the first place, which in total would worsen the community, increase crime, and would delay responsiveness of law enforcement themselves. So I personally do believe that there should be more funding allocated towards law enforcement, but in ways such as community policing resources and that sort of stuff. Do you believe that more funding towards community policing would be beneficial?
Well, yes, but the first thing you have to do is recognize that any police department that's implementing intelligence-led policing with zero tolerance policing and then says we have community policing never will. They're the antithesis of it. So before you can give funding for community policing, I think you need to root out, as I talked about, the leadership problems, the culture problems, and then the prevalent strategy of intelligence-led policing where officers are sent into largely communities of color and then enforce crime with no tolerance or zero tolerance with the idea of deterring crime. That really aggravates the community and targets people who have nothing to do with the major crimes that are taking place. And there's just no way that if you implement that strategy on Monday, you can show up Tuesday and say, hi, we're the police department. We're here to problem solve and partner with you and do some community policing. So the funding has to go towards reform and bringing in authentic community policing.
Right. And I personally believe that makes complete sense. And as you just mentioned now, and even in your book, what do you think are some common misconceptions that communities have about their law enforcement?
Well, yeah, as you noted, every police department's different. And my book really addresses urban policing. That's where the problem is. I don't know how much applicability it would have to a rural sheriff's department and, mostly white venue, but each community is different. So how they view their police department is going to be different. The community that I served in, there were police tensions, but it was even though it was a lower socioeconomic community, they were able to extend grace in our shortcomings and valued us, even though we weren't perfect. And there was some tension between the community and police, don't get me wrong. Now that I'm in Louisville, I see a community that has a very poor relationship with the police department. And I'm not blaming the police department for that. I'm just saying what it is. I mean, in Louisville, they don't even have school resource officers in the school because they don't want them. So each community is different, but there is some level of tension between the police and the community, particularly in urban communities and communities of color. But it varies across the United States, of course.
And that's a really good point that you just brought up about Louisville, Kentucky. Obviously, many communities have their own sort of relationships with their law enforcement. As I've interviewed on my podcast, some officers and law enforcement leaders here have amazing relationships and have thriving relationships with their communities. And some actually are working really hard to improve it because of what has happened in the past. And if you could just expand on it, how is the relationship between the community and law enforcement in Louisville, Kentucky, different than what you're used to seeing?
Well, I think just because of the Breonna Taylor incident, there's a lot of tension. And I think it was, I've only been here for 2 years, so it's probably nothing I can really speak too intelligently about, but I'm sure there was tension before, but there's a different political dynamic here too. And all those things are going to weigh into how the community sees the police department. But I know by reading the Department of Justice report on Louisville police that they implemented intelligence-led zero tolerance in their crime hotspots, which are going to be communities of color. And that is always, at least what I'm arguing in the book, and I think many would support, going to increase the tension and the distrust, and definitely won't improve relations between the police department and those communities.
Okay. And would you prescribe any other sort of forms of police reform to Louisville, or what would you recommend?
Well, that's what my book's saying. I'm sure that they have a very similar, in fact, I know they do, rank structure and hierarchy, which is going to lead towards toxic leadership. They have the police culture. Again, you can see it in the Department of Justice report. So they need to reform their leadership, reform the culture, change their strategies. That's the path to reform in the book.
Thank you. And what message or key takeaway would you like readers to gain from your book, Rethinking the Police?
That, first of all, I think when people read the book, well, you read it, so I hope it came across that I love the police and that this is not an anti-police book. And that I believe that most police officers, the vast majority of police officers, are doing the best that they can. But there are systemic problems in policing and the leadership and the culture and in strategies, and that we need to change those. So what I want the reader to glean from the book is what the true heart of the problem is. So when reform talks come around, we're not talking about nothing's wrong here, or we're not talking about abolish them. We start talking about the root issues so that readers would be informed and people would know what external pressures to apply to change the internal problems.
Okay. And are there any additional insights or aspects of your book that you would like to highlight for our audience?
Just that I think whether you lean to the left or to the right, that the book will, if there's any way that a book could be apolitical, this book is. In other words, it doesn't have a right-wing agenda. It doesn't have a left-wing agenda. And I think that's a good message and a good book to read in a time when everything is so politicized.
That does make a lot of sense. Thank you for actually mentioning that. Today, policing is obviously heavily politicized, and it's something that needs to be not as politicized as much, mainly because many communities are suffering. They need either better policing or they need reforms that they would really want. However, because of how politicized policing is, usually what they want doesn't come across as well. From reading your book, I see that you are very passionate about really trying to build that trust as well. And I really appreciate for you what you wrote in the book. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Of course. And going back to the interview of Trust the Badge and what you can share with the audience, what message do you have for any current or future law enforcement listening to this interview? And how can they change their perspective of law enforcement in the future?
Well, for current law enforcement officers, and this isn't something I necessarily speak about in the book, but it's a very dangerous job. And the first thing I would say to them is stay safe and be careful. But
Right.
I would say embrace the idea of change because it's needed. Because if we don't bring in some type of reform, it is more likely than not that probably some radical measures will come in that will not be helpful. And so if officers don't embrace the idea of change and welcome change, if they do rather, that is going to open the door for reasonable and helpful change. If policing stays very obstinate, then it's likely something more aggressive and not helpful will come in.
Thank you for sharing that. And ultimately, how do we as a community trust the badge?
Well, I think that policing in the United States is a trustworthy profession. The chances of you getting a good officer are very high. And as you even noted, compared to other countries, we're doing fantastic. So I don't think there's an idea that you just have to mistrust every police officer you see. However,
Right.
what you should do is read the book, understand the strategies that could be going on in your communities, and then say that this should not happen here. Don't tolerate strategies that target communities of color under the veil of a statistical analysis. And if you read the book, you'll understand what that is. So see the big picture and demand that your police department change.
For the communities listening, how exactly should they implement that sort of change after reading your book?
Well, they should be aware is so if we're talking about the strategies, the intelligence led zero tolerance is, I think, a big problem that aggravates communities. You should find out if your police department implements that. Chances are they do. Most of them have the intelligence led crimes ComStat meetings. And then the number one methodology that's going to come from that is strict enforcement or zero tolerance enforcement in areas that are going to be communities of color. You should find out and be vocal about ending that.
I'm sure the audience will take that to heavy consideration. Do you have any final thoughts for our audience regarding your book or anything else that you would like to cover?
Just that it is not an anti-police book. So some people see the cover and don't judge the book by its cover. Take the journey. I think it's a very reasonable solution to a serious problem in the United States right now.
Thank you, Dr. Reinhardt.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, man. Take care.
Of course, you too. Thank you for listening to this episode of Trust the Badge.